Picture this. An entire alien species drifting to the cold emptiness of space in ships that are literally dying around them. These aren't your typical metal starships, either. We're talking about massive biovessels that were once alive, breathing, growing. Now they're slowly withering away, just like the hope of the people inside them. The Keth Mori used to be legends across the galaxy. Imagine beings who could walk onto a dead rock floating in space and transform it into a paradise within decades. They were the universe's greatest terraformers, the ones everyone called when a planet needed saving. But here's what made them special, and ultimately got them into all this trouble. They didn't work alone. Each Keth Mori had a symbiotic partner, a sentient plant creature that lived with them, communicated with them, and shared their very life force. These plant partners weren't just pets or tools. They were family, friends, and colleagues all rolled into one. A Keth Mori without their plant bond was like a human without half their soul. Together, they could make deserts bloom, poison soil clean, and dead worlds come alive with incredible ecosystems that would last for thousands of years. Captain Blake remembers when his people were welcomed with open arms across 17 different star systems. Planetary governors would compete to hire Keth Mori teams. Their work was so valuable that some worlds would wait decades just for a chance to have them visit. Blake's own plant partner, a wise old tree-like being named Whisper, had helped terraform 6 different worlds during their partnership. But everything changed when the Galactic Council Science Division discovered the truth about the symbiotic relationship, what the Keth Mori had always known as natural partnership. The Council saw as something else entirely, genetic contamination. They claimed the plant bonds were actually parasites controlling Keth Mori minds. They said it was unnatural, dangerous, a threat to pure biological development across the galaxy. The accusations started small. Whispers in diplomatic circles about whether the Keth Mori were really in control of their own actions. Scientists publishing papers claiming the symbiotic relationship violated natural law. Politicians giving speeches about the need to preserve genetic purity among spacefaring species. Then came the official declaration. The Galactic Council branded every single Keth Mori as a genetic deviant, a classification that meant they had no rights, no protections, and no place in civilized space. Overnight, a species that had spent centuries healing worlds became outcasts with prices on their heads. Blake still remembers that terrible day when Council enforcement fleets arrived at their homeworld. There was no negotiation, no trial, no chance to defend themselves. Just orders to surrender for biological correction, which everyone knew meant death for both the Keth Mori and their plant partners. The evacuation was chaos. Families torn apart as they scrambled to get onto whatever grove ships could still fly. Children crying as they carried their small plant companions, not understanding why they had to leave everything behind. Elders who'd spent centuries nurturing their symbiotic bonds, now being told those bonds made them monsters. For 3 long years, they've been wandering. 3 years of being turned away from every port, every space station, every planet they approached. Even worlds they once helped terraform refused them sanctuary. The Grove ships, designed to be living vessels that could sustain themselves indefinitely, began to fail without proper care and nutrients. Their biohull started developing dark patches, like bruises on dying flesh. Life support systems that had once recycled air perfectly began to struggle. Food became scarce. The hydroponic gardens that fed the ships couldn't produce enough without the full symbiotic network operating properly. Worse, some of the older plant partners began to wither, their life force dimming as stress and poor conditions took their toll. When a plant partner died, their Keth Mori companion usually followed within days, unable to survive the severed bond. Blake watches as people grow thinner, weaker, more desperate with each passing day. Children who should be learning and growing instead spend their time tending to sick plants, trying to keep their companions alive. Adults who once brought life to dead worlds now struggle to keep life flickering in their own ships. That's when Scout Tyler bursts into Blake's quarters with news that changes everything. His young face is bright with excitement as he pulls up sensor readings on the bioscreen grown from living coral. "Captain, you need to see this," Tyler says, his voice shaking with barely contained hope. "I've found something incredible. An uncharted system, completely off the galactic maps. There's a blue-green world there, and the readings... He pauses, hardly daring to believe his own instruments. The biodiversity readings are off the charts. More life than I've ever seen on any planet, all orbiting a yellow star that doesn't exist in any council database. For the first time in 3 years, Blake feels something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. Earth's first contact protocols? Yeah, those went completely out the window within the first few hours. You know how governments spend decades planning for alien contact, creating detailed procedures and committees for every possible scenario? Well, none of that mattered when these massive organic vessels suddenly appeared on our radar screens, broadcasting distress signals that sounded nothing like any technology we'd ever heard before. Dr. Riley Harper was having her morning coffee at the International Space Station Xenobiology Lab when the emergency alerts started screaming. As the lead scientist for humanity's theoretical alien contact program, she'd spent years preparing for this moment. But nothing could prepare her for what she saw through the observation windows. These weren't the sleek metal ships from science fiction movies. These were living vessels, each one the size of a city block, with surfaces that looked like bark and coral had somehow grown together. They pulsed with a faint bioluminescent glow, and you could actually see what looked like veins running along their hulls, carrying some kind of fluid through their organic structure. The distress signals they were broadcasting weren't electronic beeps or coded messages. They sounded like wind moving through ancient forests, like the creaking of old oak trees, like whispers carried on a gentle breeze. Earth's translation computers went crazy trying to decode them, but it was obvious these beings communicated in ways we'd never imagined. When the first shuttle bay doors opened on the lead vessel, Riley held her breath. She'd theorized about alien biology for 15 years, but seeing it with her own eyes was something else entirely. The beings that emerged were tall, maybe 8 feet on average, with skin that looked exactly like tree bark, not smooth, but textured with deep grooves and patterns that seemed to tell stories of age and wisdom. But the most incredible thing about them wasn't their bark-like skin or their height. Along their arms and parts of their torso, they had these patches that were clearly photosynthetic, areas where their skin had a greenish tint and seemed to absorb light directly, just like plants do. Riley watched in amazement as these patches visibly brightened when exposed to sunlight streaming through the shuttle bay. And then she saw the companions. Each alien carried what looked like a small tree or large plant, but these weren't just plants. They moved. They responded. They seemed to communicate with their carriers through soft rustling sounds and color changes in their leaves. Riley realized she was watching something that had never been documented in any scientific literature, a truly symbiotic relationship between two intelligent species. While Riley and her team were frantically taking notes and trying to establish communication, something absolutely unprecedented was happening back on Earth. Military leaders were in emergency sessions at the Pentagon. World leaders were holding crisis meetings at the United Nations. Everyone was following the official protocols, arguing about jurisdiction and security and proper procedures for alien contact. But down on the ground, ordinary people were having a completely different reaction. Captain Jennifer Walsh was commanding a small cargo vessel near Earth's orbital traffic lanes when she got the official order to maintain distance from the alien ships. But Jennifer had grown up on a farm in Iowa, and she recognized the stress when she saw it. Those organic vessels were clearly in trouble. Their bioluminescent glow was flickering weakly, and even from a distance, she could see dark patches spreading across their hulls like some kind of disease. So Jennifer made a decision that changed everything. She loaded her cargo hold with every container of fresh water she could find, added boxes of basic medical supplies, and approached the alien fleet with her communications system broadcasting simple mathematical sequences, the universal language of friendship. Within hours, dozens of other civilian vessels were following her lead. Fishing boats loaded with fresh food, medical supply ships carrying everything from antibiotics to 4 fluids. Even tourist vessels filled with botanists and gardeners who'd heard about the plant-carrying aliens and wanted to help. The response from the Kethmori was immediate and heartbreaking. These beings, who'd been rejected and hunted across the galaxy for 3 years, suddenly found themselves surrounded by humans who weren't afraid of them, weren't disgusted by their plant bonds, but were actually fascinated and eager to help. Riley watched through her telescope as human crews worked alongside the tall aliens, helping transfer supplies to the dying bioships. She saw children in the observation decks of family vessels, pressing their faces against windows to get a better look at the tree companions. She watched as human botanists try to communicate through gestures with the Kethmori, both species pointing at plants and try to share knowledge about growing things. The most amazing moment came when a group of human gardeners from the International Botanical Society arrived with their own collection of earth plants. They offered cuttings, seeds, and small potted plants to the aliens as gifts. The Kethmori response was incredible. Their plant companions actually seemed to brighten and perk up just being near Earth's vegetation, as if they recognized kindred spirits. By the end of the first day, while politicians were still arguing about protocols, thousands of ordinary humans had already voted with their actions. They decided that beings who care for plants, who lived in harmony with other life forms, who created rather than destroyed, deserve help and friendship, not suspicion and fear. That's when Riley knew humanity was about to do something the galaxy had never seen before. Welcome the unwelcome with open arms. 6 months after first contact, and honestly, Earth had become something nobody could have imagined. The changes weren't just happening in remote research facilities or government labs. They were transforming the entire planet, one city, one forest, one river at a time. Dr. Jade Morrison still remembers the first time she walked through what used to be the edge of the Sahara Desert. As a botanist who'd spent 20 years studying how to reverse environmental damage, she thought she knew what was possible. But working alongside the Kethmori had shown her that everything she'd learned was just the beginning. Where sand dunes had stretched endlessly just months before, now there were rolling green hills dotted with trees that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The Kethmori and their plant companions hadn't just stopped the desert expansion. They'd actually rolled it back, creating fertile soil from sand and bringing life to places that had been barren for centuries. The process was incredible to watch. A Kethmori named Grove Tender would place his hands on the sand, while his plant companion, a beautiful flowering tree with silver leaves, would extend its roots deep into the ground. Together, they could literally transform dead soil into rich, black earth in a matter of hours. The plant companion would release nutrients and beneficial bacteria, while the Kethmori somehow guided the process, creating perfect growing conditions for earth plants to take root. But the desert project was just the beginning. In cities around the world, something even more amazing was happening. New York's skyline now included massive vertical forests that climbed the sides of buildings like living walls. These weren't just decorative. They were functional ecosystems that cleaned the air, filtered rainwater, and provided homes for countless birds and small animals. London's Thames River, which had been polluted for decades, was running cleaner than it had in over a century. Kethmori water specialists worked with human engineers to create living filtration systems, networks of aquatic plants and microorganisms that could break down pollutants and toxins naturally. Fish were returned to areas where they hadn't been seen in generations. The most heartwarming changes were happening in schools around the world. Traditional classroom buildings were being transformed into living structures, where walls were made of carefully grown wood and windows were framed by flowering vines. Young Kethmori, about the size of human teenagers but with the wisdom of much older beings, sat alongside human children learning math and science and history together. These weren't just integration programs. They were genuine friendships forming. Human kids were fascinated by their classmates' plant companions, which were usually small flowering bushes or vine-like creatures that could change colors to show emotions. The young Kethmori, meanwhile, were amazed by human creativity and technology, especially things like music and art that they'd never experienced before. Teacher Jessica Brooks from a school in Portland still got emotional talking about the day one of her human students, a shy 8-year-old named Tommy, started communicating with young Kethmori's plant companion through drawings. The little bush would change its flower colors in response to Tommy's pictures, and soon they developed their own visual language that bridged the gap between species. The adults were forming partnerships too. Human farmers were learning techniques that could triple crop yields without using harmful chemicals. Kethmori agriculturalists were discovering earth crops that could enhance their own plant companions' abilities. Cities that had struggled with smog for decades were breathing clean air thanks to atmospheric processors that were part technology, part living organism. But perhaps the most significant change was in how humans were starting to think about their relationship with nature. For the first time in centuries, large groups of people were seeing plants and trees not just as resources to be used, but as partners to work with. Environmental restoration wasn't just about human survival anymore. It was about creating genuinely sustainable partnerships between different forms of life. The Keth Mori were thriving too. Their population, which had been declining during their years of exile, was starting to recover. The incredible biodiversity of Earth provided nutrients and stimulation that their plant companions had never experienced. New relationships were forming between Earth plants and Keth Mori companions, creating hybrid partnerships that were producing amazing results. Everything was going perfectly. Humanity had found new friends, new teachers, new ways of living that were healing the planet instead of damaging it. The Keth Mori had found not just sanctuary, but a true home where their abilities were valued and their culture could flourish. And then everything changed in a single, terrifying moment. The Galactic Council fleet dropped out of hyperspace without warning. Massive ships, each one the size of a small moon, appeared in Earth's outer solar system like angry storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Their message was broadcast simultaneously to every government on Earth in perfect, cold English. Attention, primitive world. You are harboring genetic aberrants in violation of galactic law. Surrender all Keth Mori individuals for immediate termination, or face the consequences of your defiance. Admiral Connor Hayes was in his office at the Pacific Fleet headquarters when the message came through. A career military officer who'd spent 30 years defending Earth's interests, Hayes had seen a lot of threats. But he'd also spent the last 6 months watching his own granddaughter learn to sing songs that made Keth Mori plant companions bloom with joy. His response was immediate, broadcast back to the Council fleet on all frequencies, short and to the point. Come and take them. The battle lasted only 3 hours, but those 3 hours changed everything we thought we knew about Earth's place in the universe. The Galactic Council fleet had arrived expecting to face a primitive world with basic rocket technology and simple weapons. What they found instead was something that shocked them to their core. Admiral Connor Hayes stood on the bridge of the flagship New Horizon, watching as the Council's massive vessels moved into attack formation. These ships were the size of small cities, armed with weapons that could crack planets and shields that had never been breached in 1,000 years of galactic warfare. By every logical calculation, Earth should have surrendered immediately. But the Council commanders had made one critical mistake. They'd assumed humans would fight the same way every other species did. Instead of traditional steel warships rising to meet them, the Council fleet found themselves facing something they'd never encountered before. Hybrid vessels that were part technology, part living organism emerged from hidden positions throughout the solar system. These ships had organic hulls that could heal damage in real time, bioengines that ran on photosynthesis and fusion power combined, and weapon systems that nobody in the galaxy had ever imagined. Captain Lisa Chin commanded one of these hybrid vessels, a beautiful ship that looked like a cross between a submarine and a flowering tree. Her crew was a mixture of human engineers and Keth Mori biospecialists, working together at control stations that grew from the ship's living hull. When Council energy weapons struck her vessel, instead of explosive damage, the hull simply absorbed the energy and redirected it to strengthen their own shields. The Council's first wave of attacks was devastating, or should have been. Their plasma cannons and disruptor beams would have vaporized any normal fleet. But these hybrid ships danced through the energy blasts, their organic hulls bending and flexing to avoid damage, their bio-neural networks allowing them to react faster than any artificial computer system. But the real surprise came from Earth itself. The planet's surface was now covered with what the humans called grove networks, interconnected systems of Keth Mori plants and Earth vegetation that could communicate across continents in seconds. When damaged ships limped back toward Earth, these grove networks reached out with tendrils of light and energy, literally healing hull breaches and restoring power systems in minutes instead of weeks. Engineer Jake Morrison watched in amazement as his heavily damaged cruiser was embraced by glowing vines that emerged from Earth's atmosphere. The ship's torn hull began knitting itself back together, guided by some kind of biotechnology that was beyond anything he'd studied in 20 years of starship design. Within 10 minutes, his vessel was not just repaired, but actually stronger than before. The Council forces were bewildered. Their battle computers couldn't understand what they were fighting. These weren't machines or even traditional bioships. They were something entirely new, a fusion of organic and technological systems that seemed to learn and adapt with every exchange of fire. But the Council had one final weapon they'd been saving, something they called the Purification Beam. This was their ultimate solution to the Kethmori problem, a weapon specifically designed to target and destroy the symbiotic biology that connected the aliens to their plant companions. It was supposed to be impossible to defend against because it targeted life itself at the cellular level. Dr. Riley Harper was monitoring the weapon's approach from her laboratory when the beam struck Earth's surface. Every human scientist held their breath, watching their instruments, waiting for the catastrophic readings that would mean the death of every Kethmori and their companions on the planet. The beam hit. Energy cascaded across continents, seeking out the specific genetic markers that identified Kethmori symbiotic biology. And absolutely nothing happened. The readings showed the beam making contact, showed it spreading across the globe, showed it trying to lock onto its targets. But the Kethmori and their plant companions continued living, thriving, completely unaffected. What the Council didn't know was that human geneticists had been working with Kethmori biospecialists for months, studying the symbiotic relationship and finding ways to enhance it. The plant companions weren't just living on Earth now. They were part of Earth's ecosystem, integrated with human-developed biotechnologies that had made them stronger and more resilient than they'd ever been. The purification beam that was supposed to destroy them instead found targets that were so deeply integrated with Earth's life systems that attacking them would mean attacking the planet itself. And Earth's biosphere, enhanced by 6 months of Kethmori partnership, was far too robust and complex for the weapon to handle. On the Council flagship, alarms were screaming. Their most powerful weapon had not just failed, it had been completely ineffective. The genetic markers they were targeting were still there, but they were somehow protected by biological systems the Council had never encountered. Fleet Commander Zach Thor stared at his readings in disbelief. In 3,000 years of galactic law enforcement, no weapon had ever failed so completely. These primitive humans hadn't just offended the genetic aberrants. They'd somehow made them stronger. The withdrawal order came within minutes. The Council fleet pulled back beyond Earth's solar system, but not before broadcasting one final message. By harboring genetic deviants and resisting purification, this world is declared rogue territory, cut off from galactic civilization. Any attempt to leave this system will be met with immediate destruction. As the massive ships disappeared into hyperspace, humanity and the Kethmori stood together on a world that was now officially an outcast from galactic society. And for the first time in their history, neither species cared about being rejected by the galaxy at all. 2 years after first contact, Ambassador Blake walked through the corridors of what used to be the United Nations building in New York, and he still couldn't believe how much everything had changed. The structure itself was a perfect symbol of what humanity and the Kethmori had built together. Walls of living wood that grew stronger every year, metal supports that were actually bioengineered alloys, and windows made from crystallized tree sap that could adjust their transparency based on the light outside. As Blake made his way to the main assembly hall, he passed gardens that seemed to float in midair, suspended by vine networks that created their own microecosystems. Children from both species played together in these aerial gardens, human kids teaching Kethmori youngsters how to play hide-and-seek, while the young aliens showed their friends how to make flowers bloom with just a touch. The assembly hall itself was breathtaking. Instead of the old sterile conference room with its cold marble and harsh lighting, delegates now met in a space that felt like being inside a living cathedral. The ceiling was formed by intertwined branches that filtered sunlight into soft, dancing patterns. The floor was a mosaic of different woods that had grown together naturally, creating patterns that told the story of two species learning to work as one. Blake took his place at the speaker's podium, which wasn't really a podium at all, but rather a raised section of floor that had grown from the living wood beneath his feet. Looking out at the assembled delegates, humans in their business suits, sitting next to Kethmori with their bark-like skin and photosynthetic patches glowing softly in the filtered light, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. 2 years ago, Blake began, his voice carrying easily through the living acoustics of the hall, my people were dying. We were outcasts, rejected by every civilized world in the galaxy, watching our children waste away in failing ships while the universe turned its back on us. He paused, looking at the faces before him. Human delegate Rachel Kim nodded encouragingly from the front row, while her Keth Mori partner Leaf Singer rustled his companion plant in what Blake had learned was their species' equivalent of applause. Today, I stand before you in a world that has become more than we ever dared to hope for. Not just a refuge, but a true home. And what a home it had become. The statistics Blake had reviewed that morning were almost unbelievable. Keth Mori reproduction rates hadn't just improved, they'd tripled. Earth's incredible biodiversity provided stimulation and nutrients that their plant companions had never experienced. Young Keth Mori couples were forming new symbiotic bonds with Earth plants, creating hybrid partnerships that were producing innovations nobody had imagined possible. Meanwhile, human cities had transformed into something that would have seemed like fantasy just 2 years earlier. Los Angeles, once famous for its smog, now had air so clean you could see the mountains clearly every single day. The secret was the atmospheric processors, living networks of plants and biotechnology that filtered pollution while actually strengthening the local ecosystem. Detroit had become the world's first fully sustainable city, where every building was partially alive, growing its own energy systems and recycling waste through biological processes. The old automotive factories now produced bioships, vehicles that could heal themselves and run on sunlight and water. But perhaps the most amazing transformation was in how both species thought about their future. Dr. Jade Morrison, now serving as Earth's Minister of Ecological Development, had just presented plans for their first joint mission beyond Earth's solar system. Not a military expedition or a trading venture, but something the galaxy had never seen before, a gardening mission. We're not going out there to conquer worlds or extract resources, Blake continued, his voice growing stronger with emotion. We're going to plant seeds, literal seeds, but also seeds of hope, of cooperation, of a different way of living. The mission plans were ambitious, but beautiful in their simplicity. Human engineering would provide the ships and navigation systems. Keth Mori biospecialists would bring their terraforming expertise and plant companions. Together, they would seek out dead or dying worlds and bring them back to life, creating sanctuaries for any species that needed them. They weren't trying to build an empire or join the galactic community that had rejected them. They were creating something entirely new, a network of garden worlds where different species could live together, share knowledge, and build something better than what had come before. Blake looked out at the delegates again, seeing the mixture of excitement and determination in their faces. The Galactic Council had cut them off from civilized space, thinking they were punishing them. Instead, they'd freed humanity and the Keth Mori to pursue their own vision of what civilization could be. The galaxy rejected us, Blake said, his voice filled with quiet pride. They called us genetic deviants and primitive rebels. They isolated us, thinking we would wither and die without their approval. He smiled, gesturing toward the living walls around them. The gardens visible through the biocrystalline windows, the children playing in aerial ecosystems that cleaned the air while they laughed. But sometimes the galaxy's rejects find exactly where they belong. Sometimes paradise isn't about joining the cosmic community. It's about creating something infinitely better than what came before. As the assembled delegates rose in applause, Blake realized that being outcasts had become their greatest gift. Free from galactic politics and ancient prejudices, they were writing a completely new chapter in the story of what different species could accomplish together. The universe was vast, and there were countless worlds that needed healing, countless species that needed hope. They had work to do,